So we're continuing on with Ruth. I'm going to come straight from chapter 1 into chapter 2. And I'm going to do the same kind of thing that Abnel did last week. Pull something from each few verses, and then eventually we kind of work at some of the overarching themes, okay? So in my intro slide to Ruth, you can see just that. We're going to get into the story of Naomi and Ruth today. This is not script. Open it up for you guys, because this is not scripture literature. It's not scripture that's doctrine. It's not the kind of thing that's going to hit you square between the eyes with what it wants to say. It's a story. It's like you're sitting around and you're reading a story. It's like, what's a favorite novel of people here? Zach, what's one of your favorite novels? That's on par. All right, Sophie? A story or a book, yeah. The what? The summer I what? I turned pretty. Sorry. I thought you said I learned to breathe, but that's good. That sounds like a lovely book. Jason, do you have one? Diary would be good. All right. Thank you, Zach, for getting that door. All right. So we all have some stories that we like. So I'm going to try and, from this story of Naomi and Ruth, bring out the big themes, all right? And we're going to do that by going verse by verse. But I'm going to tell you right off the bat that there's an overarching theme that we're going to get to by the end of our time together. That is that God has put you where you are, and he works in our everyday lives to bless us if we're faithful, and to give us eyes to see his provision, all right? So God has put you right where you are. So we're going to start with some reading, and I've asked a few folks here. I've voluntold some folks here to help us out. So we'll go to the first slide, and I'm going to actually have Damon kick us off. Damon, would you read 1 through 3? If you can probably go from this slide as well. It's up to you.
Now Naomi had a relative on her husband's side from the clan of Elimelech, a man of standing, whose name was Boaz. And Ruth, the Moabitess, said to Naomi,
"Let me go to the fields and pick up the leftover grain behind anyone in whose eyes I find favor."
Naomi said to her,
"Go ahead, my daughter."
So she went out and began to glean in the fields behind the harvesters. As it turned out, she found herself working in a field belonging to Boaz, who was from the clan of Elimelech.
Thank you, sir. All right, so let's set up the story a little bit here. We're coming in from what Abnel had to teach us last week, right? So our context here is that Naomi went with her husband Elimelech and their 2 sons, and their 2 sons married in Moab, where they went to because of the famine happening in Israel. And Naomi's husband Elimelech died, and then her 2 sons passed away. So Naomi is in a pretty tough place, and then she decides from that space to head back to Israel because there's food there again. And with her comes her daughter-in-law, Ruth. So here we are getting a little bit of an idea of what it's like for them to live in Israel. And we'll unpack it a little bit because it's kind of in between the lines. But here it says, Ruth was talking to Naomi, and she says, "Let me go to the field and glean among the ears of grain after him in whose sight I shall find favor." So basically, Naomi and Ruth are in a tough place. Naomi is a widow, as is Ruth, and that means that in general you don't have much standing in the society. You are one of the people that's overlooked. And we have plenty of those people nowadays who are kind of, on the borders of our society, the people who are forgotten often. So they are 2 people that we have their story in Scripture that would be forgotten normally. And so here's Ruth kind of getting after it. She's saying, let me go to the field. Like, all I can do is go and try and get us some food. And as a result of the law in Israel, she was able to go and get food because even though she was a foreigner, because she's technically a Moabite, she was able to, as a foreigner, glean from the field behind whoever in whose sight she would have favor. So Naomi and Ruth are in a bitter place. That's where I'm setting it right now because just from chapter 2 or chapter 1, if you'll remember, Abnel mentioned how Naomi had come into Israel. People had started to recognize her, and they said, "Is that Naomi? It's been a while. Like, it's been at least 10 years. Naomi, what's happening?" She's like, "Please don't call me Naomi. Call me Mara." And Mara means bitter. So they're now in a bitter place. They're in a tough space right now. Imagine a place where you have little standing, you have little community, you don't have people to support you, and you don't have much food. Like something as basic as not having the food you need, And then something as basic as, not having a mom or dad to look after you, Can you imagine being in that place? That's maybe an equivalent spot to where they are. So they are in a bitter place. So we're going to continue on to the next verse and see kind of what comes next, because Ruth said, of course, I'm going to go to the fields. So for verse 4 through 7, I'll just read this bit, and then I'll have some others join in the next few, because we have plenty of chances of reading Scripture tonight. It says here, verse 4, "And behold, Boaz came from Bethlehem, and he said to the reapers, 'The Lord be with you.' And they answered, 'The Lord bless you.' Then Boaz said to his young man who was in charge of the reapers, 'Whose young woman is this?' And the servant who was in charge of the reapers answered, 'She is the young Moabite woman who came back with Naomi from the country of Moab. She said, "Please let me glean and gather among the sheaves after the reapers." So she came, and she's continued from early morning until now, except for a short rest.'" So here we have Boaz introduced. So we know Naomi, we know Ruth, and now we have Boaz. And right off the bat, Boaz is just a good guy. Boaz strolls up. He's going to his farm, which, he owns, he runs successfully, and he has a great rapport with his workers. It's like a great boss, someone that you go in to work for, or a great teacher, someone that you go in to learn from, and you love to learn from them. You come in, and you're just excited to be learning from them. And, if you're employed elsewhere, you're going in for a boss, and you're excited to be working with them. They say, "The Lord bless you," as Boaz says, "The Lord be with you." So here we have Boaz, who's just a good guy. And he's also on top of things. Because he notices there's this young Moabite woman, or there's this young woman. He's like, "Who is that?" And since he's so on top of things, he's asking his servants, like, "Hey, what's the deal with her? Is she doing all right?" basically. And then they say, "This is who it is." So he gets a little bit of background. And I'm now logged out of my notes on my computer, so we're going to see if I can get back in those. But that's basically what we need from verse 4 and 7. So we're going to go through to the next one. And this is where Boaz and Ruth meet. So out of my volunteers to do this, I'm going to have Zach read us 8 through 13. All right? Go ahead, Zach.
So Boaz said to Ruth,
"My daughter, listen to me. Don't go and glean in another field, and don't go away from here. Stay here with my servant girls. Watch the field where the men are harvesting, and follow along after the girls. I've told the men not to touch you. And whenever you are thirsty, go and get a drink from the water jars the men have filled."
At this, she bowed down with her face to the ground. She exclaimed,
Why have I found such favor in your eyes that you notice me, a foreigner?
Boaz replied,
"I've been told all about what you have done for your mother-in-law since the death of your husband. How you left your father and mother and your homeland and came to live with the people you did not know before. May the Lord repay you for what you have done. May you be richly rewarded by the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to take refuge."
May I continue to find favor in your eyes, my lord.
she said.
You have given me comfort and have spoken kindly to your servant, though I do not have the standing of one of your servant girls.
Thank you, Zach. So here is Boaz and Ruth meeting for the first time. This is totally coincidental. Of course, we read the story and we get a little bit of idea this is where it's headed. But this is Ruth, who's just been a humble servant worker, not even a servant, below a servant, has just been a worker in the fields. And here's Boaz, who runs the whole gambit. And they get to meet. And right here you see, just off the bat, that they are both really solid people. They're what we call righteous people. And eventually we'll see they're called noble people, noble character. Boaz is this good man, and Ruth is this good woman. And here, of course, you see a little bit of how Boaz is referencing Ruth's story and how he's impressed with the character that she's shown, right? So we call it the meet cute because in this story, the meet cute is when the two romantic characters meet for the very first time. So this being a story of romance and a story of God's provision, but a story of romance in the everyday characters and everyday lives. We have this, the meeting of Boaz and Ruth, our two main characters in this story, all right? And then our next section is going to be verse 14 through 16. It's going to be our first date, all right? So this is at mealtime. So for this one, Bryn, can I have you read for us?
At mealtime, Boaz said to her,
"Come over here. Have some bread and dip it in the wine vinegar.
When she sat down with the harvesters, he offered her some roasted grain. She ate all she wanted and had some left over. As she got up to glean, Boaz gave orders to his men.
Even if she gathers among the sheaves, don't embarrass her. Rather, pull out some stalks for her from the bundles and leave them for her to pick up. And don't
So
rebuke
here,
her.
the point is that you see Boaz is an extra special, extra kind guy. So in verse 15, when it says that Ruth rose to glean after they had their dinner, that's a first date, that's the tongue-in-cheek, but after they had their dinner, then Ruth is going out to work again, and Boaz grabs his guys like, guys, come here. Okay, I have something to say to you guys about what's happening with Ruth right now. He says, I want you to look out for her especially, okay? Because the way it usually worked is Ruth would go out, and whatever the workers would, they'd harvest, they'd get all the grains that they need, and whatever just like happened to fall, whatever was just kind of left over, that would be what Ruth could get. So it's kind of like the crumbs from the table. You have a sandwich, hopefully a crumbly sandwich when your dog's at the side, so they're hoping that some crumbs just fall off, right? So that's what they're going to lap up on the side, just on the counter. And then for Ruth, it's kind of a similar thing. She's just hoping for the crumbs from this harvest. But Boaz is saying here, no, don't give her the crumbs. Take something out of what we harvest. Take that out and leave it for her. Let her glean, as if it's something natural that she would pick up. It's like, you see your dog and you feel pity, and you're like, okay, you can have a little bit of this. And you just give him a chip or two. It's like your mom's like, what are you doing? Well, you're supposed to be doing that, okay? Because you're being gracious. So here we see Boaz is being especially kind to Ruth, all right? So for the next one, this is Ruth just working away, all right? So I'm going to read aloud this, and it says, so she gleaned in the field until evening. Then she beat out what she had gleaned, and it was about an ephah of barley. And she took it up and went into the city. Her mother-in-law saw what she had gleaned. She also brought out and gave her what food she had left over after being satisfied. So Ruth brought a little bit of food, brought a little bit of food home, the stuff that she worked for throughout the day, but then also the stuff that she had from dinner, and then she brought it home to her mom Naomi. So finally, after this point, we have the next bit of the story, 19 through 20. Eli, can you read for us?
Her mother-in-law asked her,
Where did you glean today? Where did you work? Blessed be the man who took notice of you.
Then Ruth told her mother-in-law about the one at whose place she had been working.
The name of the man I worked with today is Boaz.
She said.
The Lord bless him.
Naomi said to her daughter-in-law.
He has not stopped showing his kindness to the living and the dead.
She added,
That man is our close relative. He is one of our kinsman redeemers.
So, can anyone remember what the first few verses of this book said? Way back at the beginning of when we all started our time together with this teaching. Right, exactly. So that's actually even better memory than what I'm asking for. That's chapter 1. I'm asking about even chapter 2. So in chapter 2, Damon? Exactly. So it being in the time of Judges gives us our overarching context, but it talking about Boaz in chapter 2 gives us the kind of context for the story. So we know who Boaz is. Ruth doesn't know who Boaz is. So here it is. It's the great reveal. And Naomi's like, you're with Boaz? You know who that guy is? And she says, this is the guy who could potentially bring redemption to our family. So I'm going to leave the topic of kinsman redeemer, which will come up later in our teachings in a couple weeks from now. But in essence, Boaz has the ability to restore Naomi and Ruth to their state of, having protection and having provision and having kids ultimately, or at least for Ruth, having kids. So Naomi, understandably, is very excited about this because this just happened. It said in verse 3, as it happened, or by coincidence, Ruth just happened to go into this field. Because when she went out, she said, let's see who I find favor with, who in whose sight I find favor. I'm going to go and glean in whichever field in whose sight I have favor. Happens to be Boaz, who is potentially this guy that can bring this restoration to their situation. So this is what we call the great reveal. And then for our last bit, Dalton's going to be reading for us, 21 through 23.
Then Ruth the Moabitess said,
He even said to me, stay with my workers until they finish harvesting all my grain.
Naomi said to Ruth, her daughter-in-law,
It will be good for you, my daughter, to go with his girls, because in someone else's field you might be harmed.
So Ruth stayed close to the servant girls of Boaz to glean until the barley and wheat harvests were finished, and she lived with her mother-in-law.
So now we kind of go back to our overarching vision. just after this point, Ruth and Naomi are realizing what this means, and Naomi's then encouraging her. We're taken care of now. As it says just at the end here, they were able to go through the rest of the harvest, and they were to be provided for throughout the rest of the harvest. So Naomi's saying, we're good to go. So keep up with this, and you'll be safe there, and it's very exciting that this is Boaz. So we've had all the characters kind of partake and meet, and we see these stories kind of intertwining. And now you may ask, okay, so how is God working in all this? Because this is a story of God's provision, right? And we're not getting any explicit, God did this, and he moved this chess piece so that this would happen and this would take place, all that kind of stuff. So we're going to talk a little bit about how is God actually a part of this very specific story, and how is he a part of the everyday lives of Ruth and of Naomi and of Boaz, and ultimately how is he in the everyday lives of us? How is he involved in that? So one of the ways in which God is revealed in this is through Boaz's character. Through Boaz's kindness, God is revealed to Ruth. So you can see what we were already talking about with Boaz being, very thoughtful and providing and protecting on behalf of Ruth. He is reflecting God's character there. And that's a way in which we see God taking part in Ruth's life. The other way that we see him taking part and taking place is through his orchestration, through him setting out these events in the everyday decision-making of Ruth and Naomi's life. So we'll go to the next slide now. And so verse 20, we're talking about something I'll get right back to. But verse 3, it says, so she, Ruth, set out and went and gleaned in the field after the reapers, and she happened to come to the part of the field belonging to Boaz, who is the clan of Elimelech. She happened to come to the part. So this happening, it's ironic, because in this whole story about Ruth and her story of redemption and this family being redeemed and being provided for by God, this happenstance, was totally provided for by God. So God did this. And in this kind of random event, Ruth goes out and she says, I'm going to figure out, I'm going to be respectful, I'm going to work hard, but I'm going to figure out where the heck I'll go work, and I just hope I find someone's favor. I'm in whose side I find favor just means like, whoever will let me work, that's where I'm going to work. Lo and behold, it's in the field belonging to Boaz. So here we see this is providential. And providential meaning this was meant to be. God meant for this to be, right? And so in our everyday lives, there are things that take place, and God did mean for them to be. God is overseeing, and he's part of these things that are happening. So the point of verse 20 is just, again, revealing how God is at work in this story. So when Naomi says, may he be blessed by the Lord, whose kindness is not forsaken the living and the dead, you don't actually know who she's talking about when she said, whose kindness is not forsaken the living and the dead. She could be saying Boaz. She could be saying God. So it's supposed to be ambiguous there. It's supposed to be murky, because Boaz is revealing God's character. Again, that's the point that we were talking about before. Here, Boaz's reflection of the character of God is, in a very real way, representing God in this story. All right? So there are a couple ways in which every day we see God at work. The next thing we see is God's blessing. So on the next slide, it's pretty apparent. She, as in Ruth, is provided for. She's got safety. She's not only got provision, she's got safety in that Boaz said, I'm not going to let anybody harm you. You're going to be taken care of. She's got food not only for that day, she's got a dinner, she's also got harvest from that day, and she's got it for the remainder of that season. It's already said, throughout the rest of the season, they're going to be taken care of. Boaz says it's good to go. So the blessing here is pretty apparent. So we're going to kind of move on from there and get into being faithfulness. So we see God's faithfulness, but there's a question of, what's our part in the faithfulness here? And if God is working every day in our life, ultimately to grant us a blessing and to give us eyes to see his provision, as we said, then, what are the ways in which we are faithful so that we might see that and that we might receive his blessing? And so we see here Ruth's faithfulness, and it looks like loyalty. So Ruth has clung to Naomi. That's from Abnel's teaching. And some of the things that we also see in this passage are her work ethic. We kind of glanced over it now, but Ruth was working hard. When Boaz asked her boys, what's happening? They were like, this lady's been working a long time. she's been working since morning, has only had a short rest. She's the Moabitess, and then they tell Boaz the whole story. But having worked so hard, we see that she, has an incredible work ethic, and she does that so that she and Naomi can eat, can be provided for. So she is working hard to provide for Naomi, her person. And we also see how humble she is, right? In all her exchanges with Boaz, she's incredibly humble. So from this point, I want to say that Ruth, her faithfulness is most fully displayed when we see her taking her situation for what it is and deciding to serve others and serve God in that situation. So for our next bit, I'm going to be looking at how this kind of applies to us today when we talk about faithfulness. I was just considering, what are kind of some of the things that our culture has to say about, being in a place and being committed to people and seeking to serve others. I think that it's not too far a venture to say that we're in a time where all of our social media, all the things that we use to connect with people can be a great thing, but in a lot of ways, I think it teaches us that we're not supposed to be where we are. Either it's FOMO, so the fear of missing out, which maybe you guys have experienced, maybe it's just a buzzword at this point, but it is the idea that you see someone doing something and they're having a great time, and I'm naturally drawn to it. It's a comparison game. You say, I wish I was there. I wish I was doing what they were doing, or I wish my life was at a certain stage, or I wish I was having this much fun, this kind of stuff. And in truth, I think, though there are a lot of good parts to the facilitation that we get in communicating with social media, I think that's a difficult part, because I think our culture is telling us you shouldn't be content with where you are right now. You shouldn't be settled there. You should be elsewhere. It's teaching us discontentment. Whereas in this story, though our culture is teaching us and telling us that we're not where we're supposed to be, it's evident with a woman like Ruth, whose story has gone like a roller coaster, upside down and sideways. She's decided, Naomi is my person. She's the one that I can be working for, that I can be blessing. I'm going to commit to her. And this is a humble, humble story. This is a story that shouldn't get much press, but it's in the Bible, so it does. But this is one that would easily just, fall away in the backwaters. But here we have this story because this is the kind of faithfulness that's pleasing to God. So my question for you all is, consider where you are right now and why you're there. And I mean to ask, in school, in family, in sports, in arts, in singing, in piano, in whatever else you guys are doing. Why are you there now? Is there a specific reason? And my answer is yes. God has put you here even for a reason, and he's put you wherever you are in your lives for a reason. And so, as Ruth has answered the call faithfully to try and serve others, how can you all serve others? In what ways in your specific situations can you be serving others? I challenge you all with that. Consider it. Take it to heart. And then, as we seek to be faithful, God will bless us. And so we saw the ways in which he's blessing Ruth, and that will, come to flourish even more as we continue on these stories. But sometimes we face difficult times, and we feel we're being faithful, but maybe the blessing isn't coming the way we're thinking it. And so this will, what I have to say now, will be a part of kind of the larger story of Ruth. But the blessing that God offers here is not only the provision and the protection that comes through Boaz for Ruth and Naomi, but it's ultimately going to be the redemption of Ruth and Naomi through Boaz. And even further than that, it's going to be the redemption of the nation of Israel. This was a big motion, guys. We're talking about a very specific story, a very humble story, and then we're getting into an entire nation of Israel. And based on what we know about Jesus, who came through the nation of Israel, that's also the whole world. So that's what ends up happening out of this story, this crazy little small headline story. It wouldn't even make it on a local newspaper, okay? And here we have a full provision because the book of Ruth ends with a genealogy. And the genealogy is talking about all the dads that made their way all the way to David. And who, ultimately, do we know came from the line of David? Good work. All right. Jesus. We're doing a little crucifix that you know. little Jesus Christ superstar. So Jesus came from this line, and that's an ultimate provision, and that's an ultimate redemption. And so what I'm saying is this blessing that came from this story is something that came that was far beyond even what, Naomi and Ruth kind of had the vision to see. And while we're reading this, we can now see that in light of the fact that we know who Jesus is. And so blessing might not look exactly like you get all the things that you want. It might not exactly look like you get all the things that you feel you need. But the greatest blessing has been taken care of. And so now, our role is to trust God in what he's already given us. So this is, again, a theme that we'll get into. But the one for tonight is to reference how God has blessed and provided for us, how he does take part in our everyday lives, and how we are called to, in our everyday lives, to be faithful to him. So how can we do that? And with that, I believe we will kind of taper off. Now we're going to be going into our discussion group. So a few of our questions that we'll be working through are essentially the